Hello everyone, welcome. We're White Christian Union. I'm Daniel, this is Jamie.
Hello.
If you're still grabbing food, there's still plenty of seats here at the front. Do come sit down. Take your time. If you haven't got food yet, there should still be plenty at the back.
Alright, just a bit of admin quickly. Is there anyone called Michael here? Raise your hand if you're called Michael. Any Michaels in the room? Alright, good. Yeah, that concludes the mic check. We'll move straight into the talk then. We're going to talk from a guy called Steve, who's he's done a PhD. He's a research fellow in Nottingham. He's going to be talking with us about suffering, and we've had lots of answers to our question. We appreciate those. Hopefully, we'll use them a little bit later on, and we can do some questions regarding these answers that you've seen. We'll have a Q&A after the talk. I'm going to invite Steve up now, real quick. And I have a quick question for Steve. We did a question yesterday, and I've got another one for him. If you had 4 days to live, what would you do on the third day?
Alright, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Brilliant. If I had 4 days left to live, what would I do on the third one? Hard question, isn't it? I think, well, do you know, I'd want to reserve the last one for all the important stuff, like saying goodbye to people and all the sad stuff. So I think the other 3 days I just want to experience things like a bungee jump and a skydive, and so I'd probably be skydiving on the third day.
Fill out the bucket list. Well, thanks for coming, Steve. I'll hand over to you now.
Alright, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming along to the talk, and thank you if you've been coming along throughout this week. You'll know that this week we are running a week of wonder, and the purpose of this week is to engage you with some of the topics that are important today, and to maybe give the Christian perspective and how that might clash with other perspectives. It's a week to encourage you to explore for yourselves some of the deeper questions, which is, after all, what university is for, isn't it? It's to be able to come and explore and ask questions and not necessarily lean on the beliefs that we've been brought up with, but to find out for ourselves. On Monday, we were looking at some of the intellectual arguments. We were thinking about, how do we know truth? Can we say that God exists? Is there any evidence for that? Yesterday we were looking more at the practical implications of it. Does Christianity have anything to say about well-being and mental health? And if so, what? And how does that compare to the other views out there? And today we come to more of an objection that will often be raised against belief in God. The question about suffering in this world. And throughout this week we've been comparing the Christian worldview, which has at its centre, at the fundamental level, a God, with the pervading worldview that we sort of absorb from culture around us today, which is that the world is ultimately just physical, and our consciousness and our society and our culture has just arisen from that physical core, that there's no sort of ultimate meaning and purpose or mind behind it all. So they're the two worldviews we're contrasting. So we come to this question on suffering. And it's a really difficult question to answer. If it's true that there's a morally perfect God at the root of all reality, which is what all religions say, what Christianity says, if it's true that there's a good God right at the bottom of reality who's in control of all reality, then why is it that when we look around the world there is so much pain and so much suffering? And this is a truth that is undeniable, isn't it? When you look throughout history, we can see many wars repeated over and over again, many conflicts. We see atrocities such as that of the Holocaust, or many of the atrocities related to dictatorships around the world. We can think of the oppression of social systems, of slavery, of inequality, and the suffering that that has brought into people's lives. We can think of the poverty around the world and the pain that that brings. Or we could think about the natural disasters that happen in the world, of earthquakes, of volcano eruptions, of famine and drought, and the suffering that that inflicts on life all around. But it's not just about the history of it, is it? It's what we see every day when we turn on the news, or when we read about what's going on in other countries. When we hear about the conflict in Afghanistan, and how there is such civil unrest and the impact that has on everyday life there. Or the famine and starvation in Yemen. If you haven't read about that, go away and read about it. It's one of the worst tragedies of our day today. Or maybe you've been involved in charity efforts or volunteering where you've experienced some of that suffering firsthand. And of course, I've talked statistically and generally, but actually suffering is something that can affect us personally as well, can't it? Maybe you yourself or someone in your family or friend is going through that suffering and that pain right now. I just found out at the end of last week that one of my colleagues, his wife has been diagnosed with secondary degree cancer, which means her prognosis doesn't look great. And so when we see this suffering in the world, when we experience it ourselves, we think surely there can't be a good God behind this world. It's a really strong objection. This is how Richard Dawkins puts it. He says, look, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are not going to be lucky, and you won't find any rhythm or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So it's a real challenge, actually, if the Christian Union is here claiming that there's a God that you can get to know and you can believe in, and yet we have all this suffering. How does that marry together? Well, look, this afternoon I'm going to touch on just a couple of points in relation to that question. But I do want to say at the outset quite clearly that I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I have all the answers about how God and suffering can come together. I don't. And I actually don't think anyone fully does. There are many unknowns here. However, what I want to outlay to you over the next 15 minutes or so is that I believe that Christianity and belief in God more generally, it does make more sense as a whole of the intuitions and the experiences we have towards suffering. And I also want to say it has much more power and practical application during the suffering itself. And what I want you to think about and explore for yourself off the back of this talk is that I believe that when you contrast this with the main view, the mainstream view of today, that everything is just physical and there's no meaning or purpose behind it, the view that Richard Dawkins wrote in that quote and has, that actually the Christian, the theist worldview makes far more sense, even despite the suffering that we see. So let me unpack this now, and I'm just going to give you 4 simple points. I'm not going to be able to go into full depth of them, so I encourage you to ask around, to speak to me afterwards, to keep exploring. In fact, we've got a bookstall at the back. We've got a book that's specifically related to this question called Where is God in a Messed Up World? All the books on that bookstall are absolutely free. I found this out yesterday, isn't that great? So you can grab a book and explore this for yourself. But the hope of this talk is to give you 4 things to think about that may stimulate this question a bit further. And I'm going to use this session to speak more generally of some of the issues We've got another talk straight after by Chris. Where are you, Chris? Chris, and he's going to be looking a bit more maybe at the personal question about our own experience of suffering. All right, that was quite a lot of introduction. Let's get stuck in. I'm going to give you 4 things that theism, belief in God, Christianity believes and says that I think makes more sense of suffering in this world than the opposing view. Okay, here's the first one. Christianity, theism, it justifies why we hate suffering and pain in the world so much. Just think about this. The fact that we're asking this question means that we think that there's something wrong when suffering happens. It means that we think it matters when pain and suffering is seen across the world. But in a world where there's only physical matter, where consciousness just emerges, where I have to create my own value and there's no ultimate meaning, then why is suffering really ultimately a problem? Richard Dawkins touched on that when I gave that quote from him. He said, look, the world doesn't have any reason, doesn't have any rhyme or any justice, it just is the way it is. But the problem is that none of us actually feel that, do we? When we see suffering and pain in the world, we rightly think, that's wrong. That shouldn't be happening. In the theist and the Christian worldview, we believe that at the core of reality there is such a thing as morals and meaning. And that means that when we see things that aren't right, that are evil, that we should feel that they are wrong. And I find it hard to see how a physicalist view of the world, the pervading view of today, can account for that struggle we have when we see suffering in the world. In fact, at the core of the Christian message is this idea that God wants the world to be different. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. The idea that the world isn't as God wants it to be. And so I think a view of the world view of reality where God is at its core, where morality is at its core, makes sense of why we hate suffering so much. How do you ground that if the world is just matter and particles and energy? Ultimately, it's just stuff happening. Yet that's not what we feel when we see suffering in the world. So that's the first thing. It justifies why we hate it so much. But here's the second thing. A theistic worldview, a Christian worldview, it motivates us to help in the suffering. Now, like I've just said, the Christian worldview is that God doesn't want the world to be like it is. And in Christianity we have this idea of free will and of responsibility. In fact, the Bible teaches that as humans we have been given free will to choose to either love God and follow Him or to go our own way. Now, why is God given free will? Well, I think when you think about it and reflect on this, free will is something that is needed in order for us to truly experience love. If you program your PC or laptop or your phone so that every time you turn it on it says, I love you, ... whatever your name is. And if you did that and every time you turned on your phone it told you that it loved you, would you feel loved by that phone? And do you think that phone is experiencing love? No. Why not? Because that phone has been programmed to love you, or to say it at least. And so at the heart of Christianity is this idea that God has given us humans the will, the decision to decide to either experience the love of God and what that means, and surely that's one of the greatest things we can know, or to reject it and go our own way. And part of the suffering in the world is a result of us going our own way. Now, I'm not saying this fully explains everything about suffering. But there are so many things in this world, and when you trace the cause of the suffering, it comes down to people, to decisions, to conflict, to selfishness, to pride. Or even to indulgence. When you think of some of the situations in the world of starvation, and yet there are other areas in the world where food is just being consumed at a ridiculous degree. And so, in the Christian worldview, it is the human responsibility to respond to this suffering in the world. And in fact, more than that, throughout the Bible, throughout the teachings of Jesus, we are called to actually do something about it. To treat it as important that we are alleviating the suffering that's in the world, that we are helping those that are in need, that we are looking out for the poor and the needy. And so for the Christian, for the theist, God motivates us to do these things. Now, I'm not saying you can't be motivated to do them if you don't believe in God. But what I am saying is, God grounds why we are motivated to do it as Christians. But if your worldview is that everything is just physical and just stuff, then there's no higher calling, there's nothing above you that's telling you this is something that should be done. So the Christian worldview, the theist worldview, motivates us to help in the suffering. Here's the third point. The Christian worldview and the theist worldview strengthens people who go through the suffering. And I don't want to be glib about this, because I know that many people really struggle with the things that are presented to them in life. But there's a certain irony here. When you look across the world and you think, who are the people in the world that are questioning God because of the suffering? Do you know who it is? It's the people in the West who actually don't suffer. For those people who actually are suffering in many parts of the world, they are mostly people who believe in God. And they don't have a problem with the fact that God exists in spite of their suffering. So can you see the irony there? It's us who have life easy that think it's a problem, but for them, it's not a problem. And why is it? It's because for them who is going through suffering, and for Christians and theists who go through suffering, there is a strength that comes from knowing there's a God, from trusting in a God, from looking to a God in the midst of that suffering. Suffering is a pain and a reality we may not be able to explain, but God can provide strength in it. There's a famous Christian author and speaker called Joni Eareckson Tada, and she was a brilliant athlete. And she had a horrible accident early on in life that left her paralyzed. And it's such a horrible thing to happen to her. All her prospects are now over. She can't fulfill all those dreams. She can't enact all those things that she wished in her life. And yet I want to encourage you to Google her or look her up and listen to her speak. Because she's a Christian, and what she will say is, God is the one who has strengthened me and kept me going through that suffering. And she would even say that God teaches me and grows me and has brought me a deeper understanding of Him through that suffering. Her words, not mine. But you know, for a Christian, it's even better than that. Because for a Christian, it's not just that there's a God who may be able to strengthen us in suffering. For a Christian, we believe that God actually, Himself, came into this world as Jesus. That He experienced suffering like we do. And if you read the life of Jesus, you can pick up the books on your table, they're free to take away as well. You'll come to the part of the story where Jesus dies on the cross, the part we all know about. But sometimes we don't understand the suffering and the horrors that death was. Jesus' hands would have been pierced as a nail was hammered into that crossbar. And the execution was designed to be as humiliating as possible, that every breath that Jesus tried to take would feel like suffocation to him. That he was spat at and accused and mocked. And the Bible says that Jesus has entered into that, and one of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons is that God now experiences and is sympathetic in some way to that suffering that we face. And so as Christians we can look to Jesus, we can look to that strength. But if your worldview is just a physicalist worldview, then where is the strength that will motivate people through the suffering? And here's the fourth and final one. Belief in God, belief in Christianity provides hope to endure the suffering. And this is similar to the last point. And there's two parts to this. You see, for those who believe that there is a God who is moral and just, for a Christian, we believe that when evil things happen in this world, that there is a God who will one day ask people to give an account for that. That there is justice that will come for the suffering and the pain. So it means that that suffering or that perpetrator doesn't just get away with it. It's not a meaningless act that doesn't matter. It is something that God will require an account for. But more than that, the Christian message is that through Jesus, we can be given the promise of life after this world. Now, if you're not from a Christian background or a religious background, you will think the idea of life after death is crazy. But I want to encourage you again to explore the teachings of Jesus, explore the thinking behind theistic belief. Because if that's where it leads you to, then that's where it leads you to. And you see, for a Christian who has this hope of heaven that Jesus gives them, there is this driving force, that there is something to look to, and that one day things will be made right. But now contrast that with a worldview without God at its centre. A worldview where there's only physical stuff, and there's only matter and energy, where there's no meaning ultimately, no morality ultimately, no justice ultimately. Then where does that leave us? There is no hope in the suffering, because it is all just meaningless fizzing of particles in a way that we don't like. So those are my four main points, and hopefully they've prompted some thoughts and some discussion questions. And in a moment I'm going to take some questions from you. But let me just leave you with a thought and an idea to take away from this. Because maybe you've been exploring and thinking about theism, or some of the questions this week have made you wonder about things, or something you've read, or something a friend has said, and suffering really is something that's preventing you from coming to find out more. The thought about suffering and what it means. Look, I want to encourage you to just keep exploring who God is, all the different aspects, and how he fits into reality, and whether he makes sense of the world we experience. Let me give you a little illustration to close. I'm married. My wife is called Rachel, and she's a brilliant person. She's kind-hearted, she's a doctor, she's giving, and I know her well. I've known her for many years, and she's just wonderful, all right? She's a completely selfless person. Now, if I saw her on the other side of the road, and I saw her shouting at someone on the street, let's say someone asking for money on the street, a beggar, she was shouting at them, and she kicked away the bucket, and she was being awful and mean to this person, and I'm across the road seeing it, and it looks awful. I don't jump to the conclusion that my wife is horrible because of it. Because I know her. I know what she's done. I know who she is. Instead, what I jump to is this decision. I'm going to find out what's going on there, because it surely isn't what it seems like. And I want to encourage you to explore what Jesus said and what he taught, to read the thing on the table, to see how loving and selfless he was. Because as you do that, you'll see that to think of God as evil or detached or somehow causing the suffering, it doesn't make sense of the God that Jesus presents. And so then you can explore that issue once you know who the God of Christianity, of Jesus, was. All right, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to the questions. And sorry, I'm going to put this out there right now. Sorry if I've said anything that has offended or has in any way been insensitive on this issue. But let me hand back over and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Chris. Looks like we've got lots of questions in already. If you have more questions, please do head to Slido. The code's just there. Okay, so may as well start at the top. What makes Christianity more special than other systems of reality developed to deal with life, e.g. other religions? It's a good question.
All right, brilliant. So actually on Friday, I'll be doing a talk on why can't all routes lead to God? So if you're interested in this question of other religions and other philosophies of life, come along to that. We'll be touching on a few things. But just to this question here, there's loads of things I could say. And there are very real differences between Christianity and other religious beliefs. What I'd say is, why don't you explore it for yourself? Okay. Now the brilliant thing about Christianity is that Jesus came and claimed, if you know who I am, what I've done, then you know God. You know what I'm saying about God. You know who He is. And you can test that. You can read what Jesus said. You can think about His life. You can try and understand His teachings. You can examine whether it's historically reliable. You can approach it any way you want. But if you start with Him, you can really test it for yourself. And so I think that when you explore that for yourself, there are aspects of Christianity that for me make more sense of suffering, why it would be there, about the responsibility we have as humans, about what God has done about it. And one key thing, of course, is that Christianity is one of the only religions where God comes and enters into that suffering in the form of Jesus, so He can give us that personal sympathy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. So the next one is the causal link, maybe the other way around. Those that undergo so much suffering need a fabrication to deal with it. Interesting.
Okay, I think the word is causal, so is the causal link the other way around? You're getting all your words mixed up. I'm Steve as well, not Chris, but...
Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess the question here is getting behind this idea, well, aren't people just making up God to satisfy the struggles they have? Isn't it sort of the other way round? I think that's a good point, and I wouldn't want to use the point about the strengthening and the hope. I wouldn't want to use that as an argument that God exists. You know, it strengthens people, therefore it's true. It's clearly that doesn't work as a logical link. In fact, I'd want you to explore other philosophical arguments for God. I'd want you to look at how God could make sense of suffering and think of that more on that intellectual level and the logical level. However, we also have to think about what it means to have that worldview, what it actually means for us personally. And if there's something in us that is crying out for to be satisfied, or is crying out to be strengthened, or is feeling the pain of suffering, or whatever it may be, if that's within us, then we want to say that reality needs to connect in and account for that also. So just to reiterate, those points about God strengthening us, they're not meant to be an argument for God's existence, but they are meant to be saying, look, there's so many better implications that come from this worldview that you can find the truth of in other explorations. And the challenge, does your worldview satisfy in those areas?
Try and get pronunciations correct this time. Okay, someone's asked, isn't it better to do good for its own sake rather than doing it because God tells you to?
Okay, that's a really good question. We've got some brilliant questions here. Isn't it better to do good for its own sake rather than do it because God tells you to do it? There's loads of philosophical systems about what actually makes something good and what doesn't make something good, and we're not going to kind of dig into that now. You can speak to me after. What I would say about this is that for a Christian, it's not that, oh, I just have to do this thing. It's a tick box exercise. I have to do this good just because God said it, even though I don't want to. For the Christian, it's that God is good and that we are being changed more and more as we grow in our faith, in our religion, to actually desire that goodness. So it's not a kind of religious tick box exercise. It's actually that you grow in your desire to help those and love those and act in care towards those who are suffering. And that's certainly been my experience in my own life. I've been motivated to do that by the desires I have growing for those various different things.
Okay, another one. How can we process the suffering caused by the pandemic and still believe that God works all things for good?
Okay, good question. So if you're coming in and you're not a Christian or from your different faith, there's a verse in the Bible that says God works all things for the good of those who love him. So he's working together things for good. How can we process the suffering caused by the pandemic and still believe God works all things for good? That's a really hard question. And many philosophers will try and come up with a system, or a theodicy is the kind of technical word for it, of how suffering can somehow work together for good. And you could come up with some ideas. You could see how the COVID pandemic has maybe encouraged character traits like sacrifice and strength and perseverance, which are all good traits, or charitable efforts. So you could go down that line. But when I think about that, it's never fully satisfying. There's always an element of mystery at the end of the day. And so, for this question, I think it comes down to, who do you know God to be, and can you trust what he's saying? And that's why I'm encouraging you to explore what Jesus said about him, explore the claims of Christianity, because it's something that God has said, and so there is something there that we need to trust, that actually he is somehow going to bring out good, even in the suffering of the world.
Thank you. Okay. Someone's asked a two-part question here. Isn't there a difference between saying God and suffering can't marry up, and we don't know how they could marry up? And the second part, could God have morally sufficient reasons for allowing it that we don't understand?
Is number 2 up there? Or there you go.
There it is.
Sure. Okay, so the first part of the question, can you flick back to the first part? Okay, so a difference between God and suffering can't marry up, and we don't know how they could. Yeah, there is a difference. So to say they can't is to say that it's an absolute statement. It's impossible for these two things to come together, so it's a positive claim. To say I can't see how they could, it's more of a knowledge claim. I can't work it out, but I think they do. And I guess this feeds into the second part of the question. Couldn't we say there are reasons? And I think ultimately that is what I would say, that there must be reasons somewhere. I don't know what they are, but there must be reasons why God allows this to happen. And I've offered the suggestion of one, that free will leads to evil, it's a byproduct, but it produces the good of love and the experience of love. So there are ways we can say that, and at bottom maybe that's the truth. But I sometimes think it's not helpful to think in those terms, because we don't want to be saying, oh, all this awful stuff happens, but it doesn't matter because God is going to turn it good in the end anyway, and He's got a reason for it. You know, no, this stuff is really hard to work through. It's really difficult. But there is that final level of trust that you pointed to there, so thank you for that question.
And last question, I think. How is a child dying of disease motivating others or any other benefit? This child has nothing to benefit from suffering, so why would a good God allow this?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, really hard question. So to be clear, I'm not saying that the suffering motivates us to do good. I'm saying that God, under Christianity, God is saying that we have a responsibility over the suffering in the world. And that's what motivates us, that we are given a responsibility, and that responsibility comes from a higher reality, from God Himself. Compared to the other view, the physicalist world, there's no higher value or higher thing that's telling us to do it. So it's that is the thing that motivates us. Now, of course, pointing to the diseases and the death of children and the things that seem to have no explanation whatsoever. And yeah, that's where the difficulty in the question lies. That's where there remains sort of mystery. But what I would point out is I think you have that mystery whatever worldview that you come to. I don't think we can know all the answers. We have limited knowledge. And that's why I'm not going to stand here and say, here's a nice clean answer to the question. But if you don't believe in a God, and you see all that suffering, the problem that you are confronted with is that suffering doesn't really ultimately matter. It doesn't matter because it's just particles popping in a way you don't like. That's not what we think, is that we have to deny our humanity to look at the suffering and say it doesn't matter. And I think I'd prefer to choose the mystery of not knowing how God quite fits into this picture, but seeing that it is a real thing, a real problem, than just to deny that experience of how wrong it is in the first place. So I hope that makes sense. Come and speak to me after if you want some more debate or discussion about it.
Thank you very much, Chris. Steve.
I don't know if you do it intentionally or not.
Don't worry, I won't host again.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Perfect, thank you.